Governor Rauner wins a big round in the House, but the budget stalemate continues. We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the program where we talk about state government, sometimes the federal government, and how it just might affect your life. I'm Bernie Schoenburg from the State Journal-Register. A lot of activity at the State House this week, one big day at least. Here to discuss it, Kent Redfield is back, Professor Emeritus Political Science at University of Illinois Springfield. Kent, welcome.
Good to be here.
And Bruce Rushton, reporter for Illinois Times in Springfield.
Thanks for having me.
The Feisty Weekly. Speaking of feisty, there was a prolonged debate on the floor of the House this week. It was really kind of billed as the big battle because since the new fiscal year began July 1st, then the old contract was at least supposed to run out for many state workers, like 38,000 AFSCME workers. They've had contract extensions, but fearing perhaps draconian measures pushed by at least what the union members think, pushed from the governor's side, the legislature passed a bill saying that there can be no strike, no lockout if either side declares an impasse and the budget or the contract would be decided by an arbitrator. The governor said this was a terrible idea and pushed really hard against an override. The Senate earlier overrode the bill. Speaker Madigan of the House, with a 71 member, just the Democratic majority needed for an override, had said in advance that he had the votes to pass the override. Ultimately, that didn't happen. They only got 68 votes. What happened and what happens now?
Well, what happened is one of the members was in New York on vacation.
Which is Ken Duncan from Chicago,
right,
a Democratic state representative.
A couple of one voted present, another voted no, so there were only 68 votes. And you know, whether you could have done more arm twisting if that one absent member would have been in town, we really will never know. And so it was always, a tough to get 71 votes. The governor wins by not losing, essentially. I mean, the world is the same this morning as it was yesterday morning. We still have a contract that is not resolved. We still have a possibility of, the governor said, I won't lock out the union, but the governor could declare an impasse and put something on the table that the union would feel like they had no choice other than to strike. So it doesn't mean, it may mean we're going to negotiate a contract for 18 months like the last one. It may mean that we're going to have a really big blow up in terms of whether state workers are going to come to work or not. You would think we wouldn't do that while we still don't have a budget, that you wouldn't want to fight to have two fronts at the same time, but that possibility is certainly out there.
Bruce, what do you see?
Well, I agree, most of it with what you said. I wonder, in a sense, did the folks who were for this bill stretch too far? Because it lasted throughout, it would have lasted as long as Rauner was governor. Instead of making it last that long, what if they said, just a year or so, not stretch it out as far as they did? Because there were some folks who said I couldn't vote for it because that was one pitch against it. It was too Rauner centric here, and so as opposed to doing it for the length of time they did, perhaps if they'd have written it so that it wasn't quite so long standing, that may have had a better shot. I was frankly struck by the number of Hamlets here in the legislature. Very Shakespearean. I can't decide, so I'm going to vote present.
That was the Springfield area Republicans stood with their caucus by not voting for the override. So they, in a sense, stood with the governor, but they voted present.
Correct.
And that would be Avery Bourne of Pawnee, Tim Butler of Springfield, C.D. Davidsmeyer of Jacksonville, and Raymond Poe of Springfield all voted present, which, again, avoided, there was some speculation along the way because Sam McCanney Republican state senator from the Carlinville area, had voted with the majority to override in the Senate because he said so many state employees asked him to do that. There was some thought along the way that maybe there would be some Republican defectors who would join AFSCME in this, but that did not happen.
No.
And what is the effect on that?
Well, if you are AFSCME or labor, it's a distinction without a difference. But if you were running a campaign, then, well, I didn't vote against labor. Of course, I didn't vote with labor or for labor. And so, the general public, you might, when you get to a campaign, that might be more of a muddle. But I mean, clearly the Republicans had remarkable discipline. Can we say kind of Madigan-esque kind of discipline on the part of.
Speaking of House Speaker Michael Madigan, who did not predict the outcome of this one correctly.
Well, I mean, I think you're right. Nobody really sees, with no thinking person, that is going to say, well, look, we understand this distinction. I mean, they're vulnerable, those who did it, only in the sense they can now be painted as cowards. And, that's nobody's really been known. It's not a lot of brave people have been known to populate the Capitol. I mean, but you do have folks, for example, Sam McCann. I think he did take a tough vote. And I think he's going to be vulnerable anyway. He's got some other issues, as you have, as you have written in your coverage.
He kind of ran as an independent for governor.
Yeah, he's got, yeah.
And he needed perhaps the support that this would bring also.
Yeah, I guess, on a personal, a lot of folks are going to see it. Not surprising, but disappointing.
One thing that kind of surprised me, in the lead up to all of this vote, you had Governor Rauner doing what he has done kind of consistently for a long time, demonizing Mike Madigan, the leader of the Democrats, and saying, who's under his thumb or in his control and those that he controls. But when he won the vote, the statement from his office was calmer than that, thanking every House member who stood with taxpayers today, and we hope that we can now get serious negotiations and deliver the needed structural reforms and a balanced budget. Of course, structural reforms, in his mind, is some stuff that would lessen the power of unions, which is some of those things the Democrats, some of us believe, will not vote for. And yet the unions were much stronger, saying the governor's assault on this bill may have won the day, but poisoned the well for legislators of both parties who want to work together to solve problems. And, they just think the governor is, state employees don't want to be forced out on strike, said Roberta Lynch, who is the exec director of AFSCME, but we're determined not to let Governor Rauner undercut workers' rights, jeopardize workplace safety, or threaten the economic security of working families. The unions were much more angry, and the governor was more kind of giving. Does this indicate there might be some coming together on the budget and or the contract?
Well, I said it first. There's going to be a strike before Halloween.
You do?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And part of the reason why I say that is, as we talked off the air prior to starting, Moody's has said we're going to be reevaluating the credit rating of the state, and that could result in a downgrade as early as the end, I guess, of September, early October. That's the perfect opportunity for Rauner to say, well, I got to do what's best for everybody here, and so I'm going to declare an impasse. And so I think that it sets the stage for a work action sooner rather than later.
Well, we will certainly see. One of the points of argument, particularly the Republicans who are arguing don't take away the governor's power to negotiate. Of course, the Democrats' Representatives Committee, who was the sponsor of the bill, kept saying, this doesn't mean we won't negotiate our contract. It just means if we reach an impasse, we can't be locked out or we can't strike, and state government will not shut down. But the governor, people said, the governor's office recently announced they've reached agreement with more than 4,000 members of Teamsters unions in state government or who work for state government. Therefore, it shows they can negotiate fairly. Is that a reasonable argument?
Probably not.
It's a much different, probably they have different parameters.
The Teamsters break legs. I mean,
Oh, be nice now,
Yeah.
Okay,
Bruce.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, clearly the governor is not intending to try to break the Teamsters. Not even he would be that reckless, I don't think. But the real difference involves health care. The Teamsters, in fact, have a health care plan, and part of it was a wage freeze, and then we were moving some people from the state onto the Teamsters health care. What the governor really wants, what his original budget had, was huge savings in employee health care and retiree health care. We're talking, $700–800 million worth of savings. You don't get that unless you dramatically increase premiums, co-pays. it would
And
mean,
those are the kind of benefits the AFSCME members don't want to give back.
right, because you're essentially, if you're out of pocket for health care goes up 5% of your take home, and you're not getting a wage increase, you're taking a 5% pay cut. And I think it's telling that normally unions don't want to give up the right to strike. That they figure that's our key weapon. All of the Chicago's teachers union with their negotiations with the Chicago public schools, and yet this was a bill that was essentially labor was saying, we're willing to give up our right to strike. I think that shows how weak a position they're in and how nervous they are about what this governor might do in the labor negotiations.
And don't forget, Rauner has already reached out to the National Guard, contacted retirees. Hey, just in case there's a work stoppage, you want to keep the trains running at least a little bit. I mean, I think that's a strong signal.
And that's what you heard from the Democratic side. He's already lining up what I think some people called potential strike breakers, that kind of language.
Right.
Yeah.
And we're not talking about a trade union, a construction union that's build up a 6-month strike fund that then they can pay out of the strike fund they can pay people half of what they would been making, and those contractors are losing business to somebody else. This is an entirely different scenario. AFSCME has no strike fund. And it's not like the people that need state services are going to go to someplace else to get those state. It's an entirely different framework in terms of collective bargaining. And so I think it's, we may get a strike. We may also, the governor may, put something out there that they're willing to take just because they don't want to strike. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think he was in a strong position before the vote yesterday. And he's in the same position now. Whereas if it had passed, it would have weakened his position.
Okay. Just to let people know if they wanted to, we mentioned Ken Duncan missed the vote from Chicago. Scott Drury, another Democrat from Highwood, I believe, up in the North Chicago suburbs, voted no and said that afterwards that he had come to this decision because he talked to union people and realized that they didn't want to give up the right to strike, even in this case, because it would set a bad precedent. And Jack Franks, who often is not necessarily, he doesn't generally vote for budgets because he's upset with, if they're not in balance, and he's from Marengo up in northern Illinois, he voted present. So those were the Democrats who brought it down to 68. The state budget itself, this big vote didn't really have to do with the ongoing negotiations trying to come to some sort of budget. About 90% of the budget is being spent anyway at a clip that is higher than it might be because it's from the last fiscal year, which ended at the end of June. Those same levels, court orders have kept them going out to pay state employees and pension funds and certain things, but a lot of social service agencies have been starting to not get paid, some starting to close their doors or turn away clients. So what can be expected, and the State Museum is still on the chopping block because of the lack of a budget and is scheduled to close at the end of September unless something happens, which is kind of a big deal in Springfield. But, childcare, what's going to happen with this if the state keeps spending money but 10% of the budget isn't appropriated and they don't reach a budget and they're spending at higher levels than last year, which means that the $4 billion gap in this year's budget may grow to $6 billion.
Well, for one thing, Moody downgrades you, which means that the fiscal problem only gets worse. So far we haven't seen any it's hard for the average person to see, things seem to be going just fine. I can go get my driver's license, I can still go to the State Museum, I can, do everything that I used to be able to do. But, there's a reckoning time that's coming here, and you just can't talk about the levels of money that you've talked about without some consequences here someplace. Every day that it goes on, I think they dig their hole a little deeper. It helps in one sense, I think, perhaps, and one of my favorite subjects, is to force them perhaps to finally revisit an antiquated tax code that doesn't work.
Which even the governor talked about during the campaign. More tax, more services, and because we over rely on the income tax.
Maybe there's a silver lining blessing here to some extent, that the worse they make this, the more precarious they make this, the more it forces them to actually take some progressive action to fix, as Rauner himself has said, structural change. Not the way that he's always talked about structural change, but structural change in the sense of, okay, time to start taxing services, time time to maybe tax some retirement income. The sorts of things that progressive folks have been talking about needs to be done to put the state on firmer financial ground.
But the turnaround agenda has not gone away, which is Governor Rauner saying, I need certain points. He wants to, allow local governments not to pay prevailing wage on their projects and to decide not to collectively bargain on various items with their local unions. And the Democrats keep saying that's against our core beliefs, and that's where the impasse stands.
And you had 68 votes for essentially labor yesterday. If you're going to pass something between now and January, you need 71 votes, and you need 36 votes in the Senate. I mean, you got to have, so how we get something done becomes more problematic. Clearly, the fact that the comptroller has been in court being threatened by a federal judge with contempt because she's not complying with these a consent decree or court order to pay for services. The state is getting into a serious cash flow because we're spending money at last year's rate without having the temporary tax increase. So we've taken a big chunk out of the revenue. We're starting to spend money at we're spending money at last year's rates in lots of lots of cases. And so
except education is even higher because the governor signed the appropriation that bumped it up a little, which
we're
he
getting
demanded.
into whole bigger and bigger. The cash flow crunch is going to get bigger and bigger. And frankly, the one thing that's left on the table, higher education, has not been funded. It's $3 billion. And I think everything's going to stay open until the first of the year. If they sent, if all the regional universities sent their students home at the end of fall semester and said, don't come back until we tell you.
That would get people's attention.
That might get people's attention. I don't know how many more leverage points there are out there.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, at some point, Rauner talked about this. Everybody's talked about this. We need to start making tough decisions here. Where has there been a tough decision made? They haven't really done one yet, that I can recall. They're nibbling around the edges with things like, well, we're going to close the State Museum. A bad idea in a lot of people's estimation. But that's not the tough decision that we were led to believe based on Rauner's rhetoric early on and others that needed to be done. We're still kicking the can down the road.
Well, we'll see. There was like a press conference this last week with advocates to say that the cuts proposed, I guess just imposed by the administration on who can get child care from the state, working mothers and stuff, that they've lowered the amount of money that you can have and get that kind of service significantly, so that if you're like a single parent making minimum wage, you earn too much, according to the people there. They tried to override that with legislation this week. Again, fell one vote short, so people were worried about the Democrat that was out of town. So there is that. On the other hand, I should also say that the governor was overridden with Republican and Democratic support. I think it was 105 votes to override, when there was a comprehensive bill to try to take care of a growing problem of heroin overdose. There are, I think, more than 600 deaths in Illinois in the past year, or in the last year. Lou Lang of Skokie, a Democrat, was the chief sponsor, but it had support in the suburbs too, because it really crosses all kinds of lines as who's getting affected by this. The governor had approved the bill but cut out Medicaid payments, but advocates of the bill said, well, about 90% of the people that need these kinds of services are poor, so if you cut out Medicaid, you're cutting out most of the services that we would be given. And the governor said, we don't have the money, and other people said, well, you'll save money if you go to send people to treatment and not paying for emergency rooms and the results of overdose. So that was one thing. So and then marijuana is another thing where it appears, Bruce, that there's going to be some kind of compromise between, again, is Lou Lang why don't you discuss that?
Well, I think it's kind of a two-stepper here in a sense. Let's talk about medical marijuana first. This is a program that Lou Lang and his supporters wanted to extend for 4 years when the first dispensary finally opens, when they first start selling it. And Rauner said, no, this is a pilot program. There's no point in extending something that we haven't even seen work, whether it works or not. Let's wait, I'll extend, I think, 3 months or maybe 4 months. So it's very in the short term. Let's take a wait and see approach on this. That's really what Rauner is saying. And it's kind of hard to argue against that to a lot of people's minds, because Rauner, again, as a candidate, had been very critical of the medical marijuana program because the licenses were conducted, were given out with a great deal of secrecy. The applications were were kept secret, and there was no way to really evaluate how the process worked. Rauner, as a candidate, had very strongly said, we should just auction these off to the highest bidder. And I didn't pun, but anywho, he's kind of sticking with what he had said as a candidate. And I think that Lou Lang looked at that and said, I'll live again to fight, I'll fight another day. With the decriminalization measure, the prime candidate, Kelly Cassidy, I believe, very strident in her criticism when through his amendatory veto, he lowered the threshold of, she had said, the legislature had said, you can have 15 grams before you get in serious trouble, and the governor dialed that back to 10 grams. There were a couple other measures in there. The threshold for driving under the influence, the legislature had put it at 15 nanograms. The governor dialed it back to 5 nanograms, which is the same standard in Colorado and Washington State. And while you got Kelly Cassidy saying, "Oh, this is a terrible thing. The prisons are going to fill up. This is the sky is falling." NORML, national organization where the former marijuana laws took a look. I said, "Yeah, it's cool. Okay. We can deal with that." So he's actually shown if there's one thing where they seem to be able to calmer heads have prevailed, it's on that issue. It's not the overarching major issues.
And on the again, instead of 4 years, the governor cut it down in his amendatory veto.
It's a couple, 3 or 4 months. 3 or 4 months.
But it sounds like Lang believes they can negotiate.
Yeah, he left the door open to we can come back and revisit this next year or the year after. I mean, you've got until January 1st, 2018 before it sunsets. So there's time.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I'm always surprised when, like on the heroin bill, where rationality breaks out and we make a decision that seems to be based on the merits, on a calculation of, if you provide this treatment, you're actually going to save money. Right. And so that's, it's not like there aren't solutions to a lot of the problems, but the politics has become so murky and so difficult. And so we have childcare, which everyone agrees is a great economic development tool. You provide childcare to working families, to single mothers. You get people able to work, to stay in jobs, to grow, to build themselves up. And so, we've restricted the eligibility. We're not letting new people in. I can't believe once we get this all fixed that's not going to get partially or completely turned around.
You think it's a negotiating stand to say, the budget is so serious?
Yeah, we're putting the screws to all of the constituencies and the things that are a lot nearer and dearer to the Democrats' hearts than the Republicans. So some of this is just strategy, and it's really unfortunate for the people that need that particular service, need child care.
Yeah. Now, while all of this stuff is going on with the state, I always mentioned at the beginning of the show, the federal government, we actually have the only federal election in the country this coming Thursday, September 10th, when, because young Aaron Schock came under too much scrutiny for how he was spending money from his campaign account and his office account, and we still don't know exactly where that leads. There is a special election to finish out his term because he resigned at the end of March. Darren Lahood is a state senator from Peoria. Rob Mellon is a captain in the Army Reserve and a Quincy Senior High teacher, history teacher. And he's the Democrat, Lahood is the Republican, a couple of write-in candidates, and they are facing off Thursday. Mr. Mellon has raised something like $12,000, and Lahood, I know, was upwards of $1.5 million in this short campaign season. Mellon says that just shows Lahood is beholden, but I'm sure Lahood says that he's proud of the support that he's gotten from individuals and groups. And I think Kent, as a political science guy, $12,000 spread over 19 counties and hoping that you're going to get your word out is a very difficult way to go. And the 18th congressional district, which includes the western part of Springfield, a lot of Sangamon County, extends up to Peoria, has Bloomington, Jacksonville. So many of the people who watch the show are in the 18th. Yeah. Where's this one going, and do we even have a race here?
No, I mean, it is a very, very Republican district. The areas that were Democratic are now represented by, say, Sherry Boustros up in the
Quad Cities.
In the Quad Cities, or when they thought maybe they would have a shot at Davis's district, they put all of the education institutions are in that district. And so it's a very Republican district. There's a clear distinction. I mean, if you want your choices to be clear, I mean, they represent two very different approaches to government, but it is very Republican. Insofar as people know there's an election, it's because Lahood has got a hold of people who are likely to vote for him, or the party organizations have. You're holding on a Thursday. This may set a record for the lowest turnout that we've ever had in a special election.
Yeah. Do you think it's possible it might go below double digits? I mean, it's...
I think the primary was. Yeah. So it is very possible, and they've, the Republicans in particular have been more organized about this, and Darren Lahood, they sent out cards to send in.
Yeah. No, I think Mellon's been very energetic. He's tried to draw a clear distinction, and the distinctions are there, but I think in the modern politics, when it comes to money, unilateral disarmament is not a good strategy.
Well, we'll see where it goes, but Mr. Mellon, I think he knows he has his work cut out for him, and he's hopeful. And Senator Lahood, hopeful as well. Very sad news this week. As we tape this show, I think they haven't apprehended anybody yet, but Fox Lake policeman, a Lieutenant Joe Glinowitz, he was known as G.I. Joe up there, well-liked, close to retirement, called in that he was following some people. He was shot and killed. There was a big search. They closed off a bunch of roads in northern Illinois. John Anthony is a state representative, a Republican who used to be a Kendall County Sheriff's deputy and gave a rather impassioned speech about, all lives matter, and this is enough, and he was a friend of this lieutenant. So a lot of the national story and on guns and things comes to Illinois. I don't know. It's just sad. It's just unfortunate, and we wish the family well.
Yeah, I think it is sad. Obviously, it's sad. I think that we should be careful about jumping to conclusions. We don't know anything about the circumstance of this other than the unfortunate officer is dead. Whether he was targeted because of his status as a law enforcement officer, we don't know that.
It wasn't as clear as in
exactly.
some other cases.
It may have been some bank robbers running away with a bag of money that had a clear motive other than just his status of a law enforcement officer.
Understood.
But it's sad.
And on a happier note, Jake Arrieta threw a no-hitter for the Cubs against the Los Angeles, and coming from originally just north of Chicago and Evanston, this could be the Cubs' year. Is that right, or is that wrong to say that in Central Illinois?
That's brave in certain parts of Springfield.
It is brave indeed. And on
the Cubs have as good a shot as Mellon. Let's put it that way.
Well, we'll take that to the bank, Mr.
Take
Bruce.
that to the bank.
Kent Redfield, Bruce Rushton, thanks for joining me. Thank you for joining us. I'm Bernie Schoenburg, and we'll see you next time on Capitol View.